Captain Darius Talon stood at the command console of the starship Avenger, gazing out into the endless void of space. His fingers hovered over controls, the cold steel of the ship's bridge pressing against him as he prepared for the mission that would change everything. The Galactic Dominion had given him an order that seemed simple at first: lead a strike against the planet Theranos, home to a growing rebellion that threatened the peace the Dominion had fought so hard to establish. The order had been clear from the beginning: eliminate all resistance, wipe out the planet's infrastructure, and crush the rebellious leadership. There was no room for mercy, no room for hesitation. The fleet was ready, the weapons primed, and Darius, as always, was the perfect soldier. He had spent his entire career following orders, never questioning the reasoning behind them. This mission was just another step in his rise through the ranks. However, despite his usual unshakable focus, a single troubling thought crept into his mind, one he couldn't seem to shake. It was the face of Lyra, a woman he had met years ago during a covert operation on a distant planet. She was a brilliant scientist, intelligent and passionate about her work, and their brief encounter had left a lasting impression on him. He remembered the first time he had met her, stranded in a hostile, war-torn city. She had saved him, pulled him from the brink of death after he was injured in a skirmish. She hadn't asked for anything in return, not even a simple acknowledgement, but there was something in the way she looked at him, a kindness, a compassion that Darius hadn't seen in anyone else. It had been a fleeting moment, but it had left a mark. Lyra had shown him a side of humanity he hadn't thought existed anymore. That memory, so distant yet so vivid, resurfaced now as he prepared to lead the fleet into battle. It felt like a weight on his chest, a reminder of a time when his purpose wasn't defined by orders and cold strategy. Lyra had once spoken of peace, of finding solutions without violence, but Darius had brushed it off as naive. He was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. He could not afford to let that memory distract him, especially now. His mission was to destroy. The rebellion on Theranos was a threat to the Dominion's peace, and if they were allowed to succeed, it would encourage more uprisings in other systems. The fleet was already on its way, the commanders waiting for his signal. The memory of Lyra haunted him, but he pushed it aside. There was no time for weakness, no time for doubts. His crew was counting on him to lead them to victory, to secure the future of the Dominion. As the seconds ticked down, Darius took a deep breath and forced himself to focus. The Avengers' engines hummed, the vastness of space stretching before them. He could almost hear the echo of his orders, feel the weight of them. He was no longer Captain Darius Talon. He was the instrument of the Dominion's will. His heart beat in sync with the cold, mechanical rhythm of the ship. There was no room for hesitation. The lives of countless innocent people on Theranos were meaningless in the face of the greater good. He had been trained for this. His entire life was one of discipline, of sacrifice. And yet, as the Avenger moved closer to the planet, his mind wandered again to Lyra, to that moment when she had looked at him with nothing but concern, a stranger who had offered him help. He had promised her once that they would meet again, but he knew that was a lie. The empire he served had no place for such connections. The planet loomed ahead, its blue and green surface slowly filling the view of the bridge. It was beautiful, but Darius couldn't afford to be swayed by beauty. He had a job to do, and the job was clear. As the fleet moved into position, the first wave of bombers prepared to strike the planet's defenses, and yet Darius hesitated, just for a moment. His fingers grazed the activation button for the bombardment, his heart pounding in his chest. What if Lyra was still on that planet? What if she had become involved in the rebellion? What if, in some strange twist of fate, the person he once respected and cared for was standing on the other side of this war? The thought gnawed at him, but he quickly dismissed it. There was no room for such thoughts, no room for distractions. Duty called. And yet, as the countdown began, Darius couldn't help but wonder. Would he truly be able to carry out this mission, knowing the woman he once admired might be caught in the crossfire? The fleet of the Galactic Dominion hovered above the planet Theranos, the cold darkness of space surrounding them as the looming mass of the planet came into view. Captain Darius Talon stood at the helm of the Avenger, the flagship of the fleet, his mind focused on the mission ahead. His orders were clear, and the stakes had never been higher. The rebellion on Theranos had threatened the Dominion's peace for too long, and now it was time to end it. With a simple press of a button, the full might of the fleet would be unleashed upon the planet, reducing it to rubble. The anticipation in the air was thick, the crew silently awaiting the command to strike. Every officer aboard understood the weight of this operation. It was not just a military campaign, it was a show of power, a message to the galaxy that the Dominion's grip could not be challenged. The weapons on the ships powered up, the energy pulses humming in readiness. Darius's gaze was unwavering, his thoughts locked on the mission, blocking out all distractions. But just as he was about to issue the command to fire, a strange feeling washed over him, something he couldn't shake. It wasn't fear or hesitation, but something more, something deeper, an uncomfortable tug at his conscience. Before he could process the emotion, the ship's communication officer interrupted his thoughts. The officer's voice was tense, almost urgent. "Captain, we've received an encrypted transmission. It's from Lyra." The words hit Darius like a punch to the gut. Lyra. It had been years since he had heard her name, and the last thing he expected was for her to reach out now, of all times. The officer handed over the datapad with the message, and Darius read it in silence. "They will destroy everything. Please stop them, Darius." The words seemed to echo in his mind, vibrating with an intensity that stirred something inside him he thought he had buried long ago. The message was brief, but its impact was undeniable. He had never expected to hear from Lyra again, let alone in a moment like this. His hands shook slightly as he held the pad, his thoughts racing. The cold, calculated soldier that he had been trained to be suddenly felt foreign to him. He wasn't sure why her message hit him so hard, but it did. There was something about her plea, something about the urgency and desperation in her words, that cut through the layers of military detachment he had built around himself. Darius's first instinct was to dismiss it, to ignore the message as the noise of a past life that no longer mattered. But something stopped him. He couldn't explain it, but Lyra's words felt real, genuine. As much as he had tried to bury the memory of her, the kindness, the hope she had shown him in a time of crisis, it all rushed back to him in that moment. Was she still on Theranos? Was she part of the rebellion? His mind struggled with the idea, torn between his duty to the Dominion and the woman who had once shown him what it meant to care. For a brief moment, Darius felt a flicker of doubt, a crack in the armor that had always kept him resolute. He gripped the edge of the command console, forcing himself to think. The mission was still clear: obliterate the resistance, end the threat to the Dominion. And yet, something in Lyra's words tugged at him, refusing to let go. The destruction of Theranos would not just wipe out rebels, it would erase everything the people on that planet held dear. Was it worth it? Was it possible that what he was about to do might be wrong? Against protocol, against everything he had been trained to believe, Darius made a snap decision. Delay the assault, he ordered, his voice firm but layered with an unusual intensity. "I want a full reconnaissance team on the ground. We need to understand the situation before we proceed." His officers exchanged glances, confused by the sudden change of command, but they quickly fell in line. They knew better than to question Darius when he was so certain. The fleet's massive ships remained in orbit, silent sentinels hovering over the planet. Meanwhile, Darius's mind raced. Was it possible that Lyra had been right? Could the rebellion be more than just a group of lawless criminals? As his orders were carried out and the reconnaissance team prepared to land, Darius could only wait, the heavy weight of his decision pressing down on him. He knew that the longer he delayed, the greater the risk. The fleet was ready to strike, and every minute he wasted could cost more lives. But as the images of Lyra's plea lingered in his mind, he knew that he couldn't just follow orders blindly anymore. The question was no longer just about what was right for the Dominion. It was about what was right for him. Darius stood at the edge of the dimly lit underground facility, his breath coming in shallow, nervous gasps. The planet's surface had been a wasteland of desolate landscapes, but here, hidden beneath the ground, was something unexpected, something that could change everything. As the last member of his reconnaissance team secured the perimeter, Darius slipped away from the group, moving toward the rendezvous point he had arranged in secret. Lyra had reached out to him with a message, but he hadn't expected to find her alive, much less meeting him in this desolate place. The Dominion had painted her as an enemy, a part of the rebellion that threatened to destroy everything he had sworn to protect. Yet, as the hours passed, the doubts had begun to cloud his mind. His heart pounded in his chest as he entered the abandoned research facility. Dust hung in the air, and the sound of his boots echoing through the empty hallways felt like a reminder of just how alone he was. A small part of him wondered if he was walking into a trap. But another part, the part that had known Lyra, the part that had trusted her, kept him moving forward. His mind was a war zone, waging a battle between his loyalty to the Dominion and the pull of the past. He couldn't explain why, but he needed to see her. He needed to know if she was still the same person who had once saved his life, the person who had shown him a kind of compassion he hadn't known in the cold, unforgiving world of military service. And then there she was, standing in the middle of the large, empty room, her eyes locked on him as if time hadn't passed at all. The moment their eyes met, everything else seemed to vanish. The world around them faded away, leaving only the two of them standing in a forgotten corner of a distant world. It was as if no years had passed, no battles fought, no worlds destroyed. In that instant, it was just Darius and Lyra. She had changed, her face a little harder, her eyes reflecting the weight of everything she had endured. But she was still the same woman he had once cared for. The connection between them was undeniable, the bond they shared years ago reigniting with every heartbeat. "Darius," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion, a mix of relief and sadness. She stepped forward, her hand outstretched, but Darius hesitated, unsure of what to do, how to respond. He had always been a soldier, trained to suppress emotion, but in that moment, he felt it all, the confusion, the longing, and the fear of what he might discover. "Lyra, what is all of this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you warn me sooner?" He knew he was asking the wrong questions, but he needed answers. He needed to understand why things were so different now. Why, after all these years, he felt torn between duty and a past that seemed like a lifetime ago. Lyra took a deep breath, her expression serious, her eyes not leaving his. "The rebellion isn't what the Dominion tells you," she began, her voice steady despite the obvious weight of her words. "We are not fighting for power or conquest, Darius. We are fighting for freedom, for our homes, our families. The Dominion's leaders, they've manipulated the truth. The people of Theranos never wanted war. They just wanted to live without being controlled, without being treated as pawns in a game that doesn't even concern them." Her words hit Darius like a punch to the gut. He had spent his entire life believing in the righteousness of the Dominion, in the idea that they were a force for good, a power that brought order to the galaxy. But now, as Lyra spoke, doubts began to creep in. Could everything he had been taught be a lie? Could the rebellion truly be about freedom, not destruction? His mind raced, the conflict inside him growing stronger with each passing second. As Lyra continued to explain the true nature of the rebellion, Darius felt the old warmth between them return. It was as though the years had melted away, and all that remained was the love they had once shared. But that love now felt like a forbidden thing, a dangerous emotion in the face of his duty. He had spent so long building his life around loyalty to the Dominion, around following orders without question. But standing here with Lyra, hearing her truth, everything he thought he knew felt uncertain. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His loyalty, his purpose, was being tested in a way he never thought possible. Should he continue to follow the Dominion, the empire that had given him everything? Or had he been a tool of a corrupt system all along? The love he once felt for Lyra, the trust he had in her, clashed violently with the responsibilities he had sworn to uphold. The choices before him were no longer black and white. And as they stood there in the silence of the abandoned facility, Darius felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He couldn't ignore it any longer. His loyalty to the Dominion and the woman he had once loved were on a collision course. He would have to choose between the empire that had shaped his life and the woman who had once shown him what it meant to truly live. Darius had always prided himself on being a soldier, unwavering, focused, loyal to the cause. The Dominion's purpose had always seemed clear to him: peace, order, and strength. But now, everything he had believed in was crumbling. The more he listened to Lyra, the more the foundations of his certainty began to crack. The rebellion on Theranos was not a threat, not an enemy to be crushed without mercy. They were simply people fighting for the right to live on their own terms. They were not looking for power or conquest, as the Dominion had portrayed them. Lyra's words echoed in his mind day and night, stirring doubts he had buried deep inside. The more he learned about the rebellion's true cause, the more he began to question the methods of the Dominion, the very empire he had served his entire life. How could he have been so blind? How could he have followed orders without ever questioning them? In secret, Darius began to help Lyra. He knew the risks, but he couldn't help himself. The truth was too powerful to ignore. The soldiers he had once called brothers, the men and women who had stood by his side in battle, were not the ones who needed saving. It was the civilians of Theranos, the innocents whose lives were being torn apart by the very empire Darius had sworn to protect. Slowly, with Lyra's guidance, Darius made contact with other members of the Dominion fleet, officers, engineers, and soldiers who, like him, had begun to question the morality of their mission. He worked covertly, passing on information and rallying those who were willing to listen. It wasn't easy. Many were too deeply ingrained in the Dominion's ideology to entertain the idea of rebellion. But Darius had always been a leader, and his influence began to spread, quietly but steadily, within the ranks. Some of them had seen what he had seen, glimpses of the truth behind the Dominion's actions. Others simply needed to be reminded of the compassion they once had, the humanity they had left behind when they joined the Empire. Darius found himself growing closer to Lyra with each passing day. The connection between them, once buried by time and circumstance, had reignited with a force he hadn't anticipated. They worked together, each risking everything for the same cause. Lyra's calm strength balanced his growing sense of uncertainty. She didn't just speak of rebellion, she spoke of hope, of the possibility of a better future for the people of Theranos. For the first time in years, Darius felt like he wasn't just following orders. He was fighting for something that mattered, something beyond the cold, impersonal dictates of the Dominion. Yet, with every passing day, the danger they faced grew. Darius knew that the higher-ups in the Dominion wouldn't tolerate this. They couldn't afford to have an officer like him, someone who had once been seen as a loyal asset, questioning their authority. Word spread quickly throughout the fleet that Darius had been compromised. Whispers of his doubts reached the ears of the Dominion's leaders, and it wasn't long before they took action. The once proud captain was now a liability, a rogue element who threatened to ruin their plans. They couldn't afford to let him live. The orders came swiftly, and a deadly elite strike team was dispatched to eliminate the threat. Darius was no longer just a soldier, he was a traitor. The elite operatives were some of the best the Dominion had to offer, trained in infiltration, sabotage, and assassination. They were coming for him, and they wouldn't stop until he was either captured or dead. It wasn't just his life on the line anymore. It was Lyra's, the lives of the sympathetic officers in the fleet, and the future of the rebellion itself. As Darius received word of the strike team's approach, his mind raced. He had known this day would come, but the reality of it hit him harder than he had expected. There was no turning back now. He couldn't go back to being the obedient soldier of the Dominion. He had seen too much, learned too much. He looked at Lyra, her face a mix of concern and determination. "They're coming for me," Darius said, his voice low, a sense of finality in his words. "We have to move quickly." Lyra nodded, understanding the danger they were in, but there was a spark in her eyes. "Then we'll fight. Together." The decision had been made, and there was no more room for doubt. Darius's path had changed forever. There would be no more hiding in the shadows. The elite strike team would be here soon, and Darius was ready to face them. But this time he wouldn't be alone. He had made his choice. He was no longer a part of the Dominion. He was with Lyra, and whatever happened next, he would stand by her side. Darius and Lyra moved swiftly through the dark, dense forests of Theranos, their footsteps barely making a sound against the soft ground. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the low hum of distant winds. Every so often, Darius would glance over his shoulder, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of pursuit. They had barely managed to escape the elite strike team that had come for him, but now they were in uncharted territory, deep within the wilderness, where the Dominion's reach was limited. They had made it this far, but the danger was far from over. Darius knew his former comrades would not give up the hunt easily. Once they had identified him as a traitor, there would be no turning back. His name had become a mark of shame among the Dominion's ranks, and those who had once fought alongside him would soon become his most dangerous enemies. The truth of the rebellion's cause, which he had once dismissed, now burned in his mind. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. He could never return to the life he had known before. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, the silence between Darius and Lyra spoke volumes. There was no need for words. They both knew the gravity of their situation. They were fugitives now, and survival depended on trust. Trust in each other, and trust in the belief that what they were fighting for was worth the risk. Darius's heart, however, was heavy with doubt. He knew the risks, the cost of defying the Dominion, but the thought of what lay ahead filled him with uncertainty. Where would they go? What could they do against such an unstoppable force? Lyra, sensing his hesitation, reached out and grasped his hand. Her touch was warm, comforting, grounding him in the midst of his swirling thoughts. "Darius," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with conviction, "we can't give up now. We've come too far. There is still hope." Darius's grip tightened around her hand, but his mind remained clouded. He wanted to believe her, but everything had changed so quickly. The world he had known, the system he had upheld for so long, was crumbling around him. It felt like he was living in a dream, where nothing made sense anymore. Lyra's eyes met his, and in that moment, the bond they shared, the love that had once been lost, felt like the only thing that still held any meaning. He nodded, more to himself than to her, trying to push aside the fear and doubt that clung to him like a shadow. But just as they thought they had gained some distance, the trap snapped shut. The sound of footsteps, deliberate and heavy, broke the silence. Darius's instincts flared, and he pulled Lyra to a stop, signaling for her to remain still. His heart raced as his mind worked to process what was happening. Then, the familiar voice cut through the stillness. "Captain Talon." Darius turned, his pulse quickening. The figure emerging from the trees was none other than Lieutenant Grayson, one of his most trusted officers, a man he had fought beside on countless missions. But now there was no camaraderie in Grayson's eyes. There was only cold calculation. "Grayson." Darius's voice was tight with disbelief. The lieutenant had been one of the few who had stood by him, who had shown loyalty when others questioned his actions. Yet here he was, standing with a weapon drawn, the unmistakable look of betrayal in his gaze. "I didn't want it to come to this, Darius," Grayson said, his voice flat. "But orders are orders. The Dominion can't afford to let you disrupt the mission. You're compromised. You know too much, and I can't let you get away." Darius's heart sank as the full weight of the betrayal hit him. Grayson had been working for the higher-ups all along, feeding them information, watching Darius's every move. The man he had trusted most had been a spy. There was no time to process it, only to act. Before Darius could make a move, Grayson signaled to a group of soldiers who had been following his trail. The sound of more footsteps approaching confirmed that the strike team was closing in. In that split second, Darius knew that only chance was to run. He grabbed Lyra's hand and pulled her into the trees, sprinting with everything he had. The sounds of pursuit followed them like a shadow, but they pressed on, dodging branches, leaping over rocks, and pushing through the thick underbrush. Darius's mind raced, but all that mattered now was the escape. They couldn't afford to be caught. As they stumbled into a narrow ravine, they slowed, catching their breath. The sounds of their pursuers had faded for the moment, but Darius knew it wouldn't be long before they regrouped. They had to keep moving, keep running, but Darius couldn't shake the feeling that the fight ahead would be far more difficult than anything he had faced before. He glanced at Lyra, her face determined but wary, and for the first time in a long while, he saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. "We'll make it through this," she whispered, as if reading his thoughts. "We have to. The people of Theranos are counting on us." With her words echoing in his mind, Darius knew that no matter what came next, there was one thing he couldn't forget: the fight for freedom had just begun. The weight of the decision hung over Darius like a storm cloud, one that threatened to break at any moment. The Dominion's fleet loomed just outside the orbit of Theranos, a force of unimaginable power, poised to carry out the planetary bombardment that would erase the rebellion from existence. The cold, calculating part of Darius, the soldier who had once believed in the Empire's mission, told him that the only thing left was to follow through, to complete the mission he had been given without hesitation. The planet's survival, after all, was a threat to the peace the Dominion had worked so hard to create. And yet, standing in the thick wilderness, with Lyra's eyes fixed on him, that very same soldier faltered. She had become more than just the woman he had once loved. She was the embodiment of the truth he had so desperately tried to deny. The people of Theranos, fighting not for power, but for their freedom, had shown him a side of the galaxy he had never seen before. His loyalty to the Dominion seemed hollow now, a distant echo of a past life. But how could he abandon everything he had built? How could he turn his back on his comrades, his former brothers and sisters in arms? The decision gnawed at him as he sat in the quiet darkness of their hiding place. His thoughts turned to the massive fleet that hovered above the planet, its warships bristling with weapons capable of wiping out entire cities in moments. The higher-ups in the Dominion had made it clear there could be no mercy. The planet's leadership had to be destroyed, the rebellion crushed, and in the face of this, Darius had once believed in the righteousness of his mission. But now, with every passing hour, those beliefs were fading. As much as he wanted to return to the comfort of certainty, he knew it was a lie. The truth was clear now, laid bare by Lyra's words, by the faces of the people he had seen suffering, by the choices he had made along the way. The Dominion was not a force for peace, it was a force of control, one that crushed those who dared to seek freedom. And then the real twist of fate arrived. As Darius sat in the silence, trying to process the enormity of his dilemma, a transmission came through, encrypted from a source he knew too well. Admiral Kale, his superior officer, the man who had given him the orders to destroy Theranos. The transmission was brief but terrifying. It wasn't just the rebellion that the Dominion feared. It was the alliances the rebels had made. Darius's heart dropped as he learned that the survival of Theranos could trigger a war not only with the Dominion's enemies, but with their closest allies. The rebellion had not only united the people of Theranos, but had gained the support of other systems that the Dominion had long considered key allies. A war on two fronts would be disastrous for the Empire, and Darius knew just how far the Dominion would go to protect its control over the galaxy. In that moment, everything became crystal clear. His decision had gone from difficult to impossible. If he helped the rebels and saved Theranos, he would undoubtedly ignite a war that would cost countless lives, perhaps even his own. If he followed his orders, destroyed the planet, and crushed the rebellion, he would secure the Dominion's power, but he would lose his soul. He would lose Lyra. Time was running out. Darius could feel the pressure building inside him, the ticking of a clock echoing in his mind. The Dominion's fleet was already preparing for the bombardment. He had mere hours to make his choice. And then, in the stillness, a quiet voice broke through his thoughts. Lyra's voice, steady and resolute, but filled with fear. "Darius, I know this is hard, but you know what's right. You know what we have to do." Her words hit him like a shockwave. It wasn't just the planet he had to save. It was something bigger, something more important. It was the hope of a galaxy where people were free to live without the iron fist of an empire crushing them. Lyra wasn't asking him to make a decision for her, or for the rebels. She was asking him to make a decision for himself, for the man he could be, not the soldier he had been. And in that moment, Darius knew. There was no going back. He couldn't be the man who followed blind orders. He couldn't be the man who stood by and watched as lives were destroyed for the sake of control. With a final gut-wrenching breath, Darius made his choice. He would stand with Lyra. He would stand with the rebels. The Dominion had already shown him what it was willing to do to maintain power. Now it was time for him to choose what kind of man he would be, and the kind of future he wanted to help create. No matter the cost, no matter the consequences, he would destroy his ties with the Dominion, even if it meant losing everything he had ever known. He would fight for Theranos, for Lyra, and for the hope of a better world. The final decision had been made. The air above Theranos crackled with the energy of battle. The massive warships of the Dominion fleet hovered in orbit, their guns primed and ready to unleash a devastating bombardment. Darius stood at the helm of his own ship, now a row captain leading a counterstrike. His mind raced as he studied the fleet's movements, using every bit of knowledge he had gained over the years as a member of the Dominion. He knew their tactics, their weaknesses, and their blind spots. It was this intimate understanding that he now relied on to sabotage the invasion from within. His hand hovered over the controls, his pulse steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. There was no turning back now. The battle had begun, and the fate of Theranos and the galaxy rested on his shoulders. Darius barked orders, his voice sharp and clear through the comms. His crew moved with precision, following his lead as they maneuvered through the Dominion's fleet, avoiding fire and striking where they knew it would hurt. Darius's ship started in and out of the enemy's lines, sending waves of confusion through the fleet. The Dominion had no idea they were being sabotaged from within. They had underestimated the row captain. Meanwhile, Lyra was on the surface, working tirelessly to disable the planetary defense systems that had been set up to protect the Dominion's bombardment. Using her scientific expertise, she infiltrated the complex systems, bypassing firewalls and security protocols. Each moment that passed felt like an eternity, but Lyra was determined. She had spent years studying these systems, and now she would use that knowledge to protect the planet that had become her home. As Darius's counterstrike gained momentum, the tide of the battle began to shift. The Dominion's ships, once poised for a clean victory, now faltered. Their communication lines were disrupted, their weapons misfired, and their coordination broke down. Every move Darius made seemed to punch a hole in their once immovable defense. It was as if the Dominion was falling apart from the inside, unable to cope with the sudden disruption. Darius's heart pounded in his chest, but there was no time for hesitation. He had made the choice to stand with Lyra, and now together they were rewriting the fate of Theranos. Back on the surface, Lyra's hands flew over the controls, her mind focused as she worked to disable the final layer of planetary defense. She had never felt the weight of the moment more acutely, but there was a fire inside her that kept her going. This was more than just science. It was about the future of every person on the planet, the future of the galaxy. As the last defense system blinked offline, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She looked up at the sky, where the battle raged above, and knew that their combined efforts had turned the tide. The Dominion's fleet was no longer a threat, it was vulnerable. In the chaos of the final moments, as the last of the Dominion's ships retreated, Darius and Lyra stood side by side, their hearts racing but their spirits unbroken. The battle was over, but it had come at a great cost. Many lives had been lost on both sides, and the scars of war would linger. But they had succeeded. Theranos was saved. The future was no longer in the hands of an empire that ruled through fear, but in the hands of those who had fought for freedom. As the sun began to rise over the horizon of Theranos, casting a warm golden light across the battle-scarred planet, Darius and Lyra stood together, watching the dawn of a new era. The air was still, the sounds of war fading into the distance. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, as if it too was ready to embrace the future. In that moment, they knew they had changed the course of history. They had defied impossible odds, fought for what was right, and emerged victorious. They were no longer enemies of the Dominion. They were heroes, not because they had won, but because they had chosen to fight for something worth saving. And as the light of the new day bathed them in its glow, Darius and Lyra shared a quiet promise to build a future of peace, a future built on love, sacrifice, and the courage to defy the darkest forces of the universe. The galaxy had changed, and with it, so had they. The dawn of a new era had arrived, and they were ready to face it together.